I was not always a man of silence. There was a time when my name carried a certain dignity in Vienna, whispered in the lecture halls, spoken with measured respect in the parlors of medicine. They called me a gentleman of precision, a surgeon of uncommon restraint. I took pride in that reputation, for in those days refinement was not merely a quality of the hand, but a measure of the soul. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that beauty and science could coexist without corruption. I remember the scent of ether and varnished oak that clung to the hospital corridors, the echo of footsteps on marble floors, the gleam of instruments laid out like a soldier's parade. It was not death that frightened me then, but disorder, the vulgar chaos that came with human imperfection. My work, I told myself, was an act of restoration. To cut cleanly was to preserve dignity. To stitch well was to redeem what time had begun to take. I did not yet understand that redemption cannot be coaxed from flesh. When I speak of hands, you must forgive me if my voice trembles. To most they are mere tools, useful, clumsy, forgettable. But to me, even then, they were instruments of divine design. The curve of a knuckle, the meeting of tendon and vein, the way light fell on the back of the palm. Such details were to me what hymns are to a priest. I could read a man's entire history in his hands, the farmer's hardened grip, the painter's trembling finesse, the mother's gentle strain. Perhaps that was where my undoing began, in the belief that the hand was the truest scripture ever written. There was one evening, in the dissecting theatre, when I found myself alone after the students had gone. The lamps flickered low, and the air was heavy with alcohol and loss. I had finished a demonstration on the anatomy of the wrist, and the young men had departed with the hurried chatter of those eager to forget what they had seen. But I remained. I remember leaning over the table, studying the delicate structure of the specimen, the faint lavender tone of the veins beneath pale flesh, the soft curve of the nails. There was beauty there still, though the heart had ceased to give it warmth. I do not recall the thought that first led my hand to the scalpel once more. I only remember the quietness, that deep, tender silence that follows an act one knows to be wrong. I removed the hand carefully, as though freeing it from bondage, and placed it within a jar of clear spirit. The glass caught the light, and for a moment I believed I had done something merciful. It was a lie that would sustain me for many years. I brought it home that night, wrapped in linen. I placed it upon my study shelf, between the volumes of Galen and Vesalius. It did not disturb me. In fact, I felt accompanied, as though the room itself had gained a new listener. I would look up from my writings and find it waiting in stillness, immaculate, unchanging. I told myself that I had preserved not death, but a fragment of perfection. That belief, that terrible refinement, became my comfort. Now as I sit here with trembling fingers that no longer obey, I see the madness that lived beneath that calm exterior. But in those early years I saw only grace. I could not yet discern the shadow that follows all acts done in the name of beauty. It waited patiently like rot beneath polished wood, and I mistook its stillness for peace. It began quietly, as most sins do, a fascination that did not name itself, a whisper too subtle to be confessed aloud. I told myself I was studying, that each hand preserved in spirit was a lesson in anatomy, a devotion to form. But the truth, which I can only face now, is that I was not studying at all. I was admiring. I was worshipping. The collection grew in secret. At first there were only 2, then 4, then 7, each labeled carefully in my own hand, each from a different subject of dissection, chosen not for rarity of condition, but for symmetry, for grace. I began to see the world through their absent presence. When a woman lifted her veil to brush a tear away, I watched her fingers, not her face. When an old man clasped his hat to his chest in mourning, I noted the trembling curve of his thumb. To others I appeared merely observant, but in truth I was hunting. Vienna in those years was a city of elegance and decay in equal measure. The opera thrived even as disease consumed the lower districts. The Danube carried both the scent of lilies and rot, The morgues were full in winter, and the medical school received its share of the forgotten, the paupers, the nameless, the unclaimed. No one questioned the disappearance of a hand here, a limb there. The dead did not speak, and I assured myself the living would never know. But one night a patient arrived who would undo that illusion. Her name I remember still, Elise Baum, 22 years of age, a seamstress by trade. Her body bore the signs of the fever that had swept through the tenements that spring. Her hands, though, were unmarked. They were the hands of patience and care, the kind that repaired what others tore. I remember tracing the lines of her palm before the autopsy, seeing how her fingers still curved slightly inward, as if she were holding something invisible. When the work was done, I lingered. The attendants had gone, the lamps burned low, and I found myself again before that stillness, that perfect, wordless offering. I cannot say when the decision was made, only that it felt inevitable, like the closing of a door long left ajar. I severed the hand, cleaned it, preserved it as I had done before. But this one was different. There was tenderness in it, a gentleness that unsettled me. I placed it in its jar and carried it home beneath my coat, the glass cold against my chest. That night, as the wind moved through the shutters of my study, I could not bring myself to sleep. I sat before the fire, the jar glinting faintly beside me. It seemed almost to move, and I saw perhaps it was the light or my guilt or both. I whispered her name once, softly, to test if the silence would break. It did not. Only the faint sound of the clock answered, steady, patient, condemning. Days became weeks. I found myself speaking to it, not in madness but in longing. There was something in the stillness that felt familiar, almost compassionate. I would adjust the curtains, as though protecting it from light. I would polish the glass when dust settled upon it, as though it might breathe better for it. The room became a chapel of sorts, and I its priest. And yet beneath that strange devotion, something foul began to grow, a recognition that beauty, once confined, begins to decay. When the smell came, I did not act at once. I told myself it was the spirits evaporating, that the seal had loosened, that time was merely asserting its claim. But one night the glass cracked, hairline first, then deeper. A thin leak of fluid traced down the side, glimmering in the lamplight. I reached for it, and for the first time I recoiled. The skin, once pale as wax, had turned the faint color of bruised fruit. It seemed to accuse me, even in silence. I repaired the jar and tightened the lid. But the air of the room changed after that, thicker, heavier, alive with something unseen. I began to dream of her, not as she was, but as she might have been before death, seated by a window, sewing by candlelight, her hands graceful, her eyes lifted now and then to the street below. In those dreams she never looked at me. She only turned her hand over and over, as though showing me what I had taken. Now, all these years later, I think perhaps that was the first moment I understood the weight of possession. That to hold beauty is to kill it, and to love purity is to corrupt it by touch. Yet still I did not stop. By the autumn of that same year my collection had ceased to resemble a study at all. It had become a shrine. I moved them from the cupboards of my laboratory to the tall glass cases of my home, each arranged with a care that would have shamed an artist. They stood in rows against the dim light from the window, suspended hands, pale and perfect, as though waiting to be claimed by some unseen body. Each one had a story I told myself I still remembered. The soldier from Galicia, the pianist's apprentice, the mother taken by cholera. I told myself I was preserving the memory of labor, of grace, of touch. But the truth is simpler. I was afraid to be without them. It was then that visitors began to notice. My colleagues from the university, who once admired my precision, began to decline my invitations. The air of my study unsettled them. One young physician, a nervous man named Reiter, lingered too long before one of the cases. He asked in a voice trembling with half curiosity, half revulsion, why I displayed them so openly. I told him they were specimens, that beauty and instruction need not be at odds. He smiled thinly, nodded, and left without finishing his drink. He did not return. Within a month, whispers had begun. Vienna was a city of talk. Salons, papers, confessions exchanged over coffee and wine. Soon I was no longer invited to lecture, nor consulted in the examinations. My students began to look through me rather than at me. It was as though the entire city had turned its eyes from my shadow. But still I continued the work. The silence of the world only deepened the intimacy of my secret. I found in it a strange solace, as if the hands were listening, forgiving, keeping me company when all else withdrew. Yet loneliness is a solvent. It eats through what pride refuses to yield. I began to imagine movements in the glass, small at first, like the faint shifting of light. Sometimes I thought I saw a finger curl, a knuckle twitch. So I told myself it was reflection, the distortion of lamplight on fluid. But when I leaned close, I could have sworn I saw the faintest tremor, as though air itself pulsed around them. My sleep grew shallow. I woke to the sound of tapping, soft, rhythmic, patient, like someone politely knocking from inside. In those weeks, the fever that had carried Elise Baum to her grave began to sweep again through the city. Hospitals overflowed, and the morgue doors never closed. I volunteered to assist, though I was no longer asked. Perhaps I believed that by returning to the dead, I could atone for what I had stolen from them. But standing among the bodies, I felt something colder than guilt, recognition. Their stillness mirrored mine. Their silence was the only sound I trusted. One evening, as the lamps guttered in the dissecting hall, I found a hand unlike any I had seen before. Small, delicate, almost translucent, like fine porcelain just beginning to crack. It belonged to a child, a girl of perhaps 12. The cause of death was listed as fever and exhaustion, a phrase that could mean anything in those years. I stared longer than I should have. There was something in the curve of her palm, as if she were holding an invisible thread that led back to every sin I had ever committed. I took it. I do not know what justification I gave myself then, perhaps the purity of form, perhaps pity. But as I carried it home beneath my cloak, I felt the full weight of what I had become. The streets were empty, wet from rain, the gas lights blurred in the mist. I remember thinking how quiet the world seemed, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to speak. When I placed that small hand among the others, something in the room changed. The air grew colder, though the fire still burned. I turned away, but I could not shake the feeling that the others, all the others, had turned with me. For the first time I felt afraid in my own house, not of discovery nor of punishment, but of being watched by what could no longer see. I tried to pray that night. The words would not come. My lips moved, but each syllable fell empty, hollow, as though God himself had withdrawn his ear. I remember staring at the jars, their surfaces trembling faintly with reflected light, and realizing that I no longer knew where reverence ended and blasphemy began. It was then that I began to dream of hands without bodies, reaching upward from water, from soil, from glass, not to harm me but to find me. They moved with patience, not rage, and I in my dreams did not flee. I only waited for them to touch my face, to remind me that I had once been human. Winter came early that year, and with it the silence deepened. The snow muffled the streets of Vienna until the entire city seemed suspended in white breath. I remember standing by the window of my study, the frost spreading across the glass like veins, my reflection faintly visible behind the rows of jars. The hands looked almost peaceful in that light, their outlines blurred, their colors drained. Sometimes I could almost believe they were sleeping, waiting for spring to call them back. But the air inside the room told another story. It had grown thick, heavy with something I dared not name. I began to hear a new sound, low and rhythmic, not unlike the heartbeat of the house itself. At first I thought it was the pipes, or the winter wind through the brick. Yet the sound followed me, from my desk to the hallway, from the hallway to my bedroom. It was subtle, persistent, and human. I would wake at night and listen, counting the spaces between each faint thud, and though I told myself it was imagination, I could not sleep until it stopped. Sometimes it never did. My housekeeper, Frau Adler, was the first to remark upon the cold. She said the rooms seemed unholy, that the temperature dropped near the study door even when the fire burned. She would not step inside, not even to dust. Once she caught sight of the cases through the half-open door and crossed herself 3 times before leaving. I remember her words clearly. "There are eyes in that room, Herr Doctor, though none belong to the living." I laughed softly then to hide my unease. But when she quit without notice a week later, I did not replace her. The silence suited me. Still I felt watched. Even in the deepest night, when the lamps were extinguished and the house lay in shadow, there was a presence that lingered between waking and dream. The hands, my silent congregation, began to haunt the corners of my vision. I could not shake the sense that they wished to speak, or to be understood. I took to keeping a journal, writing down each imagined whisper or tremor as if they were symptoms of an illness. Auditory delusion, I would note, likely due to isolation. Yet even as I wrote, I began to fear that the diagnosis itself was a lie meant only for my own comfort. One evening, while recording my observations, I heard a sound unlike the others. Not the steady tapping I had grown accustomed to, but a single deliberate knock, 3 times against the glass of one of the display cases. I froze. The room was empty save for myself and the soft hiss of the fire. I waited, the pen trembling in my hand, and it came again, a slower, almost tentative. I approached the case, heart pounding with a child's dread, and peered inside. The fluid within was still, the hands unmoving. Yet the sound had been unmistakable. I leaned closer, so close that my breath fogged the glass, and whispered, "Who is it you wish to be?" Nothing answered. Only the faint echo of my own voice. That night I dreamed again. I stood in a darkened hall filled with countless hands hanging in the air, suspended by threads of light. They swayed gently, as though moved by a current I could not feel. Each one pointed toward a door at the far end of the corridor, a door of black wood carved with words I could not read. When I tried to turn away, the hands followed, their fingers curling like slow vines. I woke gasping, the sheets damp with sweat, and the knocking began again, this time from behind the wall. Days blurred after that. I scarcely left the study. I stopped writing to my colleagues, stopped attending lectures, stopped answering the door. When letters came, I burned them unopened. My appetite vanished. My reflection grew hollow-eyed and grey. The house decayed with me, wallpaper peeling, the scent of formalin saturating the air until it clung to my very skin. And yet, I felt more alive among my dead than I ever had among the living. It was during one of these endless nights that I found myself speaking aloud to them. "You forgive me," I said, staring at the smallest jar, the child's hand. "You understand why I had to preserve you." My voice quavered, and I felt something within me crack, like glass under strain. "I have given you eternity," I whispered, "and in return I ask only silence." But even as I said it, I heard another voice rise beneath mine, faint, trembling, unmistakably real. It was not an echo. It said my name. I turned, but the room was empty. The lamps flickered, and every hand seemed poised mid-motion, caught between stillness and life. I wanted to believe it was my mind unraveling, that years of solitude had finally taken their toll. But deep within that flickering half-light, I felt something else awaken, something that had been patient, listening, waiting for the moment I finally admitted what I had done. That was the night I stopped locking the study door. I no longer feared intrusion. I feared confinement. It was not the world outside that haunted me anymore. It was what I had invited in. I remember the night it began to snow inside the house. Not real snow, of course, but ash from the chimney drifting down through the cracks in the ceiling, settling on the desk, on my notes, on the jars. It was beautiful at first, almost sacred, Then I realized it was the dust of something that had burned. I could not recall what had been burning, only that the air carried the faint smell of singed cloth, and that I had been standing in the dark for some time before noticing. The knocking had stopped by then, but a worse thing had taken its place, a kind of breathing, shallow and steady, that came from within the walls. It did not frighten me at first. I had grown accustomed to strange sounds, to the small deceptions of silence. But the rhythm of this one was too precise, too human. It followed me from room to room as if the very structure of the house had lungs. Once, as I passed the stairwell, I felt warmth upon my cheek, the exhalation of something close, invisible, and watching. I told myself it was a draught, but I no longer believed my own reassurances. I spent most of those days seated before the jars, speaking softly to them. There was comfort in the ritual, in pretending they listened. I read aloud from my journals, sometimes from the Psalms. I think I hoped to sanctify what I had done, to convince myself that preservation was a form of reverence. Yet the longer I spoke, the more the words lost meaning. Scripture began to sound like anatomy. Prayers became indistinguishable from catalogues. I knew then that faith had left me quietly, like a servant who no longer wished to be seen. It was on the 3rd night of December that I first saw the movement. A trick of the lamplight, I thought. But no, the surface of the fluid rippled, though I had not touched the case. I leaned closer. The fingers within twitched. Not all at once, but slowly, like something testing the weight of its own sleep. I drew back. The breath caught in my throat. I wanted to flee, yet could not. The scientist in me, that wretched dying part, demanded observation. I waited. Minutes passed. The motion ceased. I told myself it had been an illusion. But when I lifted the lid of the case to be sure, the smell that emerged was not of decay. It was the smell of skin, warm, living, human. I did not sleep that night. I sat before the fire, shaking, the poker clutched in my hand. At some point near dawn, I began to speak aloud again, though I do not remember what I said. Pleas, perhaps. Bargains. By morning the house was silent once more, but something inside me had shifted. I realized that what I feared most was not that they might move again, but that they might not. That my sins would remain only mine to carry, unseen, unanswered. There is a kind of mercy, I think, in being punished. Weeks passed. I no longer marked the days. The letters from the university stopped. A neighbor, I forget her name, came once to ask after me, and I told her I was ill. That much was true. I was decaying from within, eaten not by disease but by memory. I saw their faces when I closed my eyes, the boy with the frostbitten hand, the seamstress, the sailor whose skin had turned the color of ivory. I had preserved their flesh, but not their stories. Each one had died nameless, and I had become their tomb. One evening, as I sat staring into the fire, I thought of my father. He had been a physician, too, cold, exacting, a man who believed emotion to be a contagion. When he died, I felt nothing. But now, decades later, I heard his voice clearly. You study what you love, Wilhelm. You take it apart to see what holds it together. Perhaps I had loved them too much, these hands, these remnants of humanity, loved them in a way that stripped them of dignity. Love, I have learned, is no absolution when born from pride. I began to write letters to the dead, small apologies scrawled in the margins of my journals. To the girl from the river, one read, I only wished to understand why your hands were clenched so tight. Another, to the thief whose fingers I kept, I have given you peace, though you never asked for it. I do not know if I believed they heard me, but I sealed each letter in an envelope and placed it beneath a jar, as if to balance a scale that had long been broken. By January I could no longer bear to look at them. The jars had become mirrors, each one reflecting not the hand inside, but my own face, distorted by glass and guilt. I considered destroying them, smashing the cases, burning the remains, yet each time I raised the hammer, my arm faltered. What right had I to end what I had tried so hard to preserve? And what if destruction released something I could not contain? The night before I fell ill, I dreamed again of the corridor. The black door at its end was open now, and a light spilled. Through, not bright but soft and grey like dawn through smoke. The hands were gone. Only my own waited there, outstretched, as if begging to be taken. I woke weeping. I do not know if it was from terror or longing. When I rose from bed, the frost on the window had melted. The air smelled faintly of iron. I went to the study, and though the fire had long gone out, the room was warm, warmer than it should have been. The lids of the jars were fogged with condensation, and something, a sound, faint and rhythmic, pulsed beneath the silence. It was then I realized the breathing had stopped, and I was the only one left who still drew breath. I do not know how many days have passed since the last entry. The candles have withered to blackened nubs, and the ink on these pages runs faint, as though the words themselves wish to flee the paper. I have begun to forget my own voice. When I speak, the sound does not belong to me. It feels borrowed, echoing from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Perhaps I have been dead for some time, and this is merely the lingering thought of what I once was. This morning, if such things can still be measured, I found the study door open. I had locked it the night before. I remember turning the key. Yet there it was, ajar, breathing out a stale warmth like the exhalation of a tomb. The jars stood in their places unbroken, though the fluid inside them had turned the color of smoke. A thin film floated on each surface. Skin, perhaps, or memory. I could no longer tell the difference. I felt no fear when I stepped inside, only recognition. The air shimmered faintly, as if the walls were sighing, as if the house itself had grown weary of silence. On the desk lay a letter, my handwriting but written in a steadier hand than I possess now. The wax seal was unbroken, though I knew what it contained. I had written it for this moment long ago, my confession, my defense, my scripture of ruin. I left it untouched. To open it would mean to end the story, and I have grown accustomed to unfinished things. There was movement again, slow, deliberate. The surface of one jar rippled, not with life, but with reflection. I leaned close and saw my own eyes staring back hollow and dark, but behind them, something else. Our shape, faint, like a second face pressed against the glass from within. I whispered its name, though no name came, and the shape mimicked me, mouth forming the same soundless syllable. It smiled. Then came the knocking, not from the walls this time, but from below, the cellar. 3 times. Then silence. I felt it through the soles of my feet, not as sound but as weight, as if the earth itself had remembered what I buried there. I wanted to flee, yet found my hand upon the latch, pulling open the cellar door. The air that rose was heavy and damp, smelling of soil and old iron. The candle in my hand trembled, as if unwilling to descend. The steps creaked beneath me. I counted each one, whispering the numbers aloud to keep my courage tethered. 11, 12, 13. The 13th step always groaned differently, as if protesting the passage of the living. When I reached the bottom, the darkness folded around me like a cloak. I could see the outline of the table, the rusted instruments still where I had left them, and in the far corner, something pale, upright, motionless. It was a figure. At first I thought it another trick of shadow, but no. The light from my trembling candle touched its surface. Skin, dull grey and intact, the contours unmistakable. A human form, though unfinished, as if sculpted from my memory of life rather than from life itself. The hands were perfect. My hands. I took a step forward, then another. Its head turned, slowly, impossibly, and toward me. There was no face, only the faint impression of one, the ghost of features that had not yet been chosen. But I knew, in the same way one knows the taste of their own name, that it was mine. My reflection waiting to be completed, I dropped the candle. The flame hissed out against the dirt, plunging me into darkness. Yet even without light, I could still see it, not with my eyes, but from somewhere deeper. It moved closer, soundless, the air bending with each step. When it finally reached me, I felt no touch, only warmth, spreading through my chest like fire through dry leaves. I do not remember falling, but I remember the sensation of weight leaving my body, the distinct relief of being unburdened. I thought I heard a breath, drawn not by me but for me. Then for the first time in years I felt peace. I am writing now from the study again, though I do not recall climbing the stairs. The letter on the desk remains sealed, but beside it, another, now lies open, in handwriting that matches mine precisely. It reads, "You have been preserved, as you preserved others. Sleep now, Wilhelm, the work is complete. I do not know who wrote it. Perhaps I did, long ago. Perhaps the hands I once collected have learned to write in my stead. The air smells of earth and iron. I feel warm, so very warm. If I close my eyes, I can hear breathing again, steady, soft, familiar. Only this time, it is not coming from the walls. It is coming from me. It has been 2 days since the cellar incident, though I can no longer trust time. The clocks have all stopped at different hours, their ticking drowned beneath a slower rhythm, one that beats within my chest. I tried to leave the house yesterday. The front door would not open, not from rust nor from any visible obstruction. It simply resisted, as though the air beyond had grown too heavy for entry. I stood there for a long while, my hand on the cold brass handle, feeling a faint pulse beneath the metal. It was beating in time with mine. I have started to forget faces, not strangers but my own. When I caught my reflection in the glass of the window, I did not recognize the man staring back. His skin was paler than I remembered, stretched too, tight over the bones, the eyes sunken as if from years without sleep. But what struck me most was the stillness. The image did not move when I did. It lingered a fraction too long, like it was deciding whether to follow. I turned away. I have stopped looking into mirrors altogether. The study, once my sanctuary, has turned against me. The air has become viscous, carrying with it the faint odor of formaldehyde and something sweeter, like spoiled fruit. The jars no longer hold still. They hum now, almost imperceptibly, like the low murmur of a congregation praying beneath the earth. Each night the sound grows louder. Sometimes I think I can make out words, fractured syllables of a language I should not understand, but do. Words of praise, words of return. I have begun to dream again. Not of the dead, but of creation. In the dream I am younger, standing before the table with the heart cupped in my hands. It beats faintly, not from blood, but from memory. I place it inside a hollow chest that is not yet human, and as I sew the flesh together, I whisper prayers I had long forgotten. The voice that answers is not divine. It tells me that I have succeeded, that the boundary has thinned, that I have made room for something else to breathe. When I wake, my hands ache. The stitches in my dreams leave faint marks on my skin, thin and red, as though reality itself is beginning to confuse what belongs to whom. I tried burning the remaining instruments, but they refused to catch flame. Even the fire has lost interest in me. There was a noise again last night, not from below this time, but from behind the study wall, a hollow rhythm, like knuckles rapping wood in perfect imitation of a heartbeat. I pressed my ear against the paneling, and for a moment it pressed back. The wall was warm, alive. I think I understand now what my work has become. I once believed I was saving fragments of the human form, preserving grace against decay, beauty against the cruelty of time. But what I was really preserving was guilt. Every hand I bottled, every nerve I stitched, every tremor I silenced, they were all pieces of the same sin, repeating itself through flesh. The dead never left my table. They simply waited for me to join them. My right hand has started to stiffen. The skin feels foreign, too smooth, too cold. I can see faint seams running across the knuckles, almost invisible unless caught in candlelight. I cannot feel the pulse beneath it anymore. When I touch it with my left hand, the sensation does not return. It is as if I am touching someone else entirely. I have begun to wonder if I am still Wilhelm Adler at all, or merely what remains after the collection has claimed its curator. I feel their weight in me, every preserved limb whispering from glass, asking to be remembered, asking to be whole again. I tell them I am sorry, but even that word now tastes wrong, too new, too rehearsed. Tonight I will sit by the cellar door once more. I will wait for the knocking. It always comes at the same hour, the one the clocks refuse to move past. I will open the door this time, not to descend, but to listen. If the voice speaks again, I will not answer with fear. I will ask what it wants of me, though I already know it does not seek forgiveness. It seeks completion, and perhaps in the quietest corner of my heart I do as well. I opened the cellar door last night, not out of courage, and I have none left, but out of the slow, inevitable pull of something that has been calling my name long before I learned how to speak it. The air that greeted me was cold, but not the cold of stone or night. It was the cold of something that had waited too long to be remembered. My candle refused to burn steady. Its flame bent inward, as though trying to hide from what lay below. Still I descended. The stairs groaned softly, like the house itself was warning me to turn back, though it knew I would not. At the foot of the steps, the cellar was no longer as I had left it. The jars had rearranged themselves. They lined the walls in perfect symmetry, each glass vessel glimmering faintly in the candlelight. Inside, the hands had shifted position, not floating as before, but pressed upright against the glass, as if reaching toward me. Their fingers were pale, swollen, and yet patient. I could feel their eyes upon me, though they had none. I knelt before the table, the one where I had done my work, and saw what had become of my tools. They were not where I left them. The scalpel rested in the center, gleaming, freshly sharpened, as though prepared for use. My gloves, stiff with dried solution, as were gone. In their place, upon the wood, lay something wrapped in a linen cloth. I do not remember placing it there. My trembling hands unwrapped it carefully. Inside was my own left glove, sewn shut at the wrist, and inside it unmistakably was flesh. My flesh. It should have horrified me, but it did not. The sight filled me with a kind of understanding, terrible, intimate understanding. For years I had told myself that my work was preservation, an act of reverence toward the human form. But I see now that I was not preserving life. I was disassembling guilt piece by piece, in search of a shape I could love without shame. And now that guilt has learned to take form without me, the whispering began again, but this time not from the jars. It came from the walls themselves, a low chorus like breath drawn through hollow bones. The language was the same as before, but clearer, more insistent. I could almost make out the words, "Return what was taken. The body remembers." I fell to my knees, covering my ears, but the sound was not in the air. It was in the blood. I looked up then and saw movement, faint, deliberate, from one of the larger jars near the back. A hand pressed harder against the glass, its nails scraping faintly, leaving small crescents of blood. Then another jar joined, then another. The sound of glass tightening filled the room, like breath caught in a throat. I staggered back, knocking over a small shelf. It crashed loudly, breaking one of the older jars, one of the first. The hand within slid out, wet and white, falling to the floor with a sound softer than I expected. It twitched, not violently, not in shock, but with a faint, purposeful motion, like an infant learning to move. I stared, frozen, as the fingers flexed, once, twice, and before curling inward almost shyly. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My throat felt stitched shut from the inside. The hand lay there, palm up, as if offering itself. I do not remember deciding to touch it. I only remember the warmth. For the first time in years, something living or not, or what remained of living, was reached back. Its touch was familiar. I could not tell if it was mine or theirs. I carried it to the table, trembling, and laid it down beneath the candlelight. The skin glistened faintly, the veins visible through the thin flesh. I pressed my own right hand beside it. The difference was imperceptible. 2 hands, 1 shadow, 1 guilt. I remember whispering something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a prayer. The air grew thick, heavy, sweet with the scent of rot and roses. The whispering stopped, and then silence, the kind that feels alive. I do not remember what happened after. Only that I awoke hours later upon the floor. The candle burned down to a puddle of wax, the hand gone. The broken jar had been set upright again. My right arm ached, and when I unbuttoned my sleeve I found new stitching along the wrist, fine, delicate, not my own work. Something is completing itself, with or without my consent. I feel it in my bones, the slow rearranging of flesh, the blending of what was collected and what remains. The body remembers, the whisper had said. I think I am beginning to understand. If creation is a sin, then I am long past redemption, and yet there is a strange peace to it, as though the horror has accepted me at last as its final piece. When I sleep now, I dream not of faces or hands, but of a great table under white light. A surgeon stands above me, though his face is my own, and around him the jars are empty. Not broken, empty, waiting. Tomorrow I think the knocking will come again, and this time I will not wait for it to stop. The house no longer sleeps. Its timbers groan with the weight of things unseen, and the walls exhale softly at night, as though something beneath them is breathing through the plaster. I have not left my study in 3 days. I cannot. The light outside has turned the color of bone, and every sound from the street feels distant, like a memory refusing to be recalled. I write these words with a trembling hand, though the trembling no longer feels entirely my own. This morning I found the cellar door open. It had not been forced. The lock was untouched, but the air that drifted upward carried the smell of formalin and wet earth. I descended with a lantern, and saw what I had both expected and feared. The jars were empty. Every single one. The shelves were bare except for a single scrap of linen, embroidered with my initials, still damp with something dark. I stood there for what must have been an hour, unable to move, unable to breathe, as if the house itself was waiting for my reaction. Then came the sound, soft, deliberate, rhythmic. Not footsteps, but tapping. Fingertips against wood. It came from above, not below. The study. I returned slowly, each stair heavier than the last, and found the door ajar. Inside, the air shimmered faintly with candle smoke. Upon my writing desk lay what I first mistook for parchment, pale, thin, and veined. But it was not parchment. It was skin, human, perfectly flattened as if pressed beneath glass. I approached it, though my mind screamed to turn away. Upon its surface, written in the faint brown ink of old blood, were words I could barely read. Completion is not mercy. It is memory. Beneath the words, a single handprint, delicate, feminine, pressed into the flesh, still damp as though it had only just been placed. It was her hand. Harriet's. I remember the shape of it even after all these years, slender, graceful, marred only by the small scar near the base of the thumb where she had once burned herself on the lamp. I used to trace that mark with my thumb when we sat together in silence. I never imagined I would see it again. Yet here it was, preserved by my own obsession. I sank into the chair, the room spinning, and memory returned like floodwater. The fever that took her, the night I could not accept it. The hour I sat by her bed long after her pulse had stopped, whispering that I would not let her fade. How I carried her hand, just her hand, down to the cellar when the doctor left. How I told myself it was love. But love does not ferment. It decays. I thought I heard her voice then, faint and trembling, coming not from the air but from within my chest. "You kept what was never yours," she said, "and now give what remains." I turned toward the mirror by the wall, and for the first time in years I saw myself clearly. My right arm, pale as ivory, moved stiffly, unnaturally. The stitching along the wrist was darker now, spreading like a bruise. When I flexed my fingers, they did not obey me. They reached outward, not forward, but toward the mirror. I watched in horror as the reflection did not match my motion. It was ahead of me, independent, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The hand in the mirror curled slowly, its veins dark and alive, and I felt the pulse echoing in my temple. I could not move. I could only watch as the reflection's mouth began to open. My mouth. But what came out was not breath. It was dust. Behind me the tapping began again, this time from the window panes. I turned, lantern trembling, and saw faint imprints upon the glass, hundreds of them, hands overlapping, pressing gently as if longing to come inside. The condensation traced their shapes in exquisite detail, the curve of fingers, the hollows of palms, the delicate marks of nails. They did not pound. They waited, patiently. I stumbled backward, my lantern spilling light across the walls, and there, beneath the faded wallpaper, were outlines forming. Human outlines, faint as stains, like moisture, seeping through from behind. Shoulders, arms, hands, dozens of them all pressed into the plaster, as though the walls themselves remembered who they had touched. The house was no longer mine. Perhaps it never had been. The whisper returned, steady now all around me. "Return what was taken." The sound grew clearer with each repetition, until it was no longer many voices, but one, hers. "Harriet," I called her name. The whisper stopped. Then, from the center of the room, the floorboards rose slightly, as though something beneath them had drawn a long, slow breath. I fell to my knees, tears breaking through my composure for the first time in decades. "Take it," I whispered to the air. "Take all of it. I am done." My hand to the one not mine began to twitch violently, then to claw at the floor, desperate, as though guided by a will outside my own. The pain was exquisite. Each movement sent fire through my nerves. I tried to stop it, but I could not. The hand was digging, splintering wood, until the boards cracked open to reveal the darkness below. The cellar. Always the cellar. And from that hollow space beneath the floor came a smell so familiar it nearly broke me. Formalin, earth, and roses. The scent of my sins. The whisper came one final time, softer now, like a lullaby. "Completion!" Then silence. My arm fell still. The lantern extinguished itself, and I sat in the dark for what might have been hours. I no longer felt pain, only the weight of what had been restored to the earth. Somewhere below I heard glass breaking. One final jar, perhaps, or the sound of memory finally releasing itself. I think it is almost over now. There is little of me left that belongs to me. Tomorrow I will open the floor completely. If I do not return, it will mean I have joined them, not as their master, but as their equal. The collector has been collected. It is morning now, though the light has not changed. It leaks through the curtains in pale ribbons, fragile and unwilling, the way truth filters into a dying mind. I have not slept. The ink is nearly gone from my pen, but I will write until it runs dry, and then I will use what remains of me. I feel the skin of my hand tightening again, not in pain, but in withdrawal. It wishes to leave me. Perhaps it already has. The floorboards gape open before me like ribs split for autopsy. Beneath them lies the damp breath of the cellar, waiting patiently as it always has. I see now that what I called my laboratory was never a place of study. It was a tomb, carefully disguised in the arrogance of intellect. Every jar I filled was a denial of time, a refusal to let decay be holy. I wanted to make beauty eternal, to hold grace in glass. But grace cannot be held. It lives only in surrender. Last night's silence was not sleep. It was remembrance. The walls whispered to me again, not in words but in the small groans of timber bending under time. I could almost hear their names, not just hers but all of them. The women, the men, the children, the anonymous poor who vanished from the city streets when the river thawed each spring. Each pair of hands catalogued, measured, preserved. Each one, I told myself, was saved from oblivion. But I was not preserving life. I was embalming mercy. I can no longer tell when memory ends and vision begins. Sometimes I think I see them at the periphery of the room, faint silhouettes in formal dress, their features blurred by dust and distance. They do not move. They only watch, the way the dead do when they have nothing left to lose. I know them all. I know the way their fingers once curled in fear, the tremors of their palms before I made them still. The city outside hums faintly, unaware of the ruin inside this house. Vienna has always been merciful to men like me, men who cloak their depravity in refinement. The neighbors still nod politely when they pass, perhaps grateful they no longer hear the faint music that once played through these walls. The waltz Harriet loved, the one I continued playing long after she was gone, because I could not bear the silence that followed. I have opened the cellar completely now. The floorboards lie scattered like bones, and below them the earth breathes cold and wet. The jars are gone, but in their place something remains, a shape forming slowly out of condensation and shadow. It looks like the outline of a woman kneeling, her arms open, her head tilted in quiet judgment. I know what she is, though I will not name her. To name her would be to claim her again, and I have done enough of that. I sit beside the opening and let my right arm hang over the edge. The flesh is pale, translucent, almost luminous in the half-light. I can see the veins shifting beneath it like threads in water. When I open my fingers, the air below stirs faintly, as though the cellar itself exhales in response. There is a pull, gentle, patient, inevitable. I do not resist. The first touch is cool. Then warmth. Something unseen clasps my wrist tenderly, as if greeting an old friend. The sensation climbs slowly up my arm, through my shoulder into my chest. It does not burn. It soothes. I feel as though the body I have carried all these years is being unstitched from within. Piece by piece, fiber by fiber, unmade into silence. I think I hear Harriet's voice again. It no longer accuses. It prays. I cannot make out the words, but I recognize the rhythm. The same prayer she whispered when the fever took her. The same one I refused to repeat at her funeral, too proud, too broken. Now I whisper it back, each syllable faltering, each breath an apology. The walls no longer hold their faces. The wallpaper has peeled away entirely, and beneath it there is only plaster, pale and unmarked. The stains are gone. The house is being cleansed, not by fire, not by faith, but by memory fulfilling itself. I understand now what the words on the flesh meant. Completion is not mercy. It is memory. There is a certain peace in knowing one's sin will outlive confession. The candle beside me gutters low. I can barely see the ink upon the page, yet I continue. My hand, or what remains of it, moves without command, tracing words I no longer need to think. The line between flesh and thought dissolves, and I realize that perhaps this is what I always sought, to merge with what I once destroyed, to become the preservation itself. If anyone finds this, do not speak my name. Do not bury me. Leave this house open. Let the wind move through it. Let the walls breathe freely again. The cellar does not need a seal. It needs witness. I can no longer feel my arm. My sight dims around the edges, as though the world itself is narrowing into a single flickering point of light. The candle's flame shivers once, twice, then steadies. She stands before me now, not as I remember her, and not young, not fevered, but whole, composed, merciful. Her eyes are not accusing. They are vast like forgiveness itself, though I dare not call it that. She reaches out a hand, and I see that it is not the one I took. It is new, restored. I bow my head, and when her palm meets mine, I feel the last warmth leave me, not taken, but returned. I hear the faint sound of glass breaking far below, and the whisper of soil closing over what was once divided. There is no fear now. Only stillness. It is done, and in the silence that follows I remember the waltz. It is the only music left.